Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us to witness the great debate over technology and prosperity, which is being hosted by ITIF. This promises to be a spirited debate between Rob Atkinson and Simon Johnson. This event is being held virtually, and again, we thank you all for joining us online. Note that we will be taking your questions through Slido, so you can get to Slido directly from the web link of the program or by hashtag tech versus prosperity in Slido. I am Carol Thomas. I serve as a director on the board of directors at ITIF, and I am also the former director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. First, I will introduce our debaters. We will follow with opening remarks from each, then rebuttal from each, a few questions from me and the audience. I have to say that this is definitely a good idea to be a virtual debate because the topic of whether or not technology and prosperity can live equally together where everybody prospers has been an age-old question. As a matter of fact, our first debater, Simon Johnson, is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School, previously chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. He's worked on global economic crises and recoveries for 3 decades. He has authored Jumpstarting America with Jonathan Gruber and White House Burning with James Kwok. Thank you. He's just coming out with a brand new book, and I was very happy to be able to get a copy and take a look at it. Power and Progress, a 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity. Excellent book that he co-authored with Dara Ashimolu. And then our next debater is Rob Atkinson, as you know, the founder and president of Information Technology Innovation Foundation, the ITIF, recognized as the world's top think tank for science and technology policy. Robert Atkinson leads a prolific team. I can absolutely say prolific team of policy analysts and fellows that successfully shaping the debate and setting the agenda on a host of critical issues at the intersection of technological innovation and public policy. And so we're going to get started, and we will start with Simon Johnson giving us his opening remarks. Simon?
Thanks very much, Carol, for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be with you. I have complete admiration and respect for ITIF and all the work you've done. And Rob and I worked previously in parallel, and I think quite effectively in parallel, on issues that were raised by my previous book, Jumpstarting America, which you kindly mentioned. This book, however, is a little bit different. I think it's an extension. I think it's consistent with Jumpstarting America. But we are grappling, Carol, exactly with what you just said, which is how do we continue technological progress? Because we will continue it and we want to continue it. But how do we what policies or other actions or decisions among individuals and companies, what could tilt it more towards shared prosperity in the United States and perhaps more broadly? Because we used to do that, Carol, very effectively, and somehow it's drifted away from us. So let me make my argument, my opening statement in 3 pieces. The first point is that people choose technology. Now, this might seem obvious to some people, and we have important technologists very active in the United States today, people like Elon Musk and Sam Altman, who explain to us what they want to do with technology and who push it in various directions. Sometimes, however, people think that technology descends from the skies, that there's nothing much you can do about it. It doesn't have much human agency. 2 pieces of evidence in my favor there. One is actually, again, the work on Jumpstarting America and that agenda, where Rob and ITIF actually led the charge in arguing that more science spending going through universities and identifying clusters around universities would be a very effective way to scale up science spending, spillover effects, commercialization, and more innovation. So definitely, I think we've already agreed on people controlling how much we innovate, more or less, moving that up and down is something we've done in the United States and something Rob and I were arguing it should be moved up. The second piece of evidence, though, on which way you tilt technology and the power of individuals, I'd go back to history. One of my favorite figures, a controversial figure, perhaps in some respects, but I have a great deal of admiration for Henry Ford. Because what Henry Ford did, came to the US, he came to the auto industry when it's in its infancy, making 20 or 30,000 cars a year. And he brought the assembly line, and then he brought electricity to the assembly line. Those were two things that we think of as being very connected, but they were actually separate big decisions by Henry Ford. By the end of the 1920s, US car industry was making 2 to 3 million cars a year. The car had become a mainstay of the middle class. And it was Henry Ford's decisions and his application of electricity in particular that boosted productivity. He did automate, and I want to be very clear about this because I think there is some scope for confusion. We are in favor of automation. I don't think you can be against automation. That 1,000-year history, Carol, is a history of automation. But what Henry Ford did, in addition to automate, and automation means you're replacing some workers. I mean, let's be very clear. But if you're also creating new jobs and new tasks in his factories, upstream from his factories, and of course, downstream from his factories, that had a tremendous job creating impact. So in that, and Ford was not alone. Ford is a very clear example of leadership. But there was a lot of that same kind of job creation through new tasks running in parallel with automation in the first half of the 20th century. And actually in the 1950s and 60s, that continued. So we still see a lot of job creation, despite the fact there was a great deal of automation. What we've seen, however, unfortunately, since 1980, and this comes with the advent of digital technology, but there was also some change in attitudes around how companies should operate, the relationship between people who own the companies and labor, globalization absolutely plays a role. So what's happened since 1980 is we've continued with automation, but unfortunately, we haven't created as many new jobs and as many new tasks. Now, it didn't get us mass unemployment. Let's be very clear about that. But if you look, for example, at labor force participation among people in factories where there was more automation, or in places, regions where there was more automation, or in industries where there's more automation, that labor force participation has declined. And of course, if we go further and look at wages, so in that post-war period, a golden age, I would say, of automation and new task creation, in that post-war period, wages of all education groups tended to rise together. I'm not saying it was a perfectly inclusive model, because we know it wasn't, but people who didn't finish high school had growing wages, just like people who'd been to college or had postgraduate degrees. Since 1980, what we've seen is a really big split in outcomes in terms of income, so that people with college degrees and above in terms of education have continued to do well. They continue to experience real wage growth. But people who haven't finished high school, for example, have in many cases a lower income than they had, or people like them had decades ago. They're often not better off than their parents, and their children do not have, in their own view, and I think the objective evidence supports this, strong prospects. So what we're arguing for is definitely not, we're not trying to stop technology. We're not trying to stop technological progress. Happy to get on any platform with you, Rob, and argue for more spending, even more spending on science and technology. But we're asking the question, can we tilt it more towards job creation, more towards helping humans? And I think that the thing that kind of sticks with us, and we spent 560 pages trying to explain this very fairly and trying to root it in the history, is that computer science and the tech industry has become a little bit too enamored of what they call machine intelligence, which means finding a way for computers and algorithms to replace humans. You can think about grocery store self-checkout kiosks, for example. So they've definitely reduced the need for grocery store clerks. They haven't boosted the productivity of the remaining workers, the marginal productivity, how much additional output or value you get if you hire one more person. The wages of those remaining grocery store clerks has not gone up. My colleague and co-author Doron Asimoglu and his co-author on this research, Pascual Restrepo, call it so-so automation. So it automates. The productivity effects are so-so. It does change the balance of power between the grocery store and the people who remain working there. They're afraid about losing their jobs, and they should be afraid. So we're not getting productivity growth of the kind that we want to get. We're not getting an acceleration in wage growth for people at the low end of the education distribution. So we're asking the question, why not tilt away from the predominant view among many tech people, which is let's find machine intelligence, tip it towards machine usefulness, which is the idea that you can make individual people more productive if you put the technology under their control as workers, as opposed to putting it exclusively under the control of employers. And I hope in the back and forth we'll get to explore this a bit more. But a good example of the issues here is the writer's strike, currently the so-called Hollywood writer's strike, which of course is for movies and for television, where the writers are saying, we want to be able to use AI, the new technology, generative AI. We want to use it to help ourselves become more creative and write better. And we want that to be part of our work product and what we get credit for. And the studios are saying, no. We want to be able to use AI to do various things like, I don't know, first drafts, for example. And then we might bring a writer in to polish it up a little bit. But that would be the property, presumably, of the studio. And the writer's not going to get the credit or not get the full credit. Now, writing and movie studios, obviously, a very particular business. Writers have an ability to potentially control that technology. We may not see that in a grocery store context. But I think that is the key issue, which is generative AI is absolutely coming. We can't stop it. We don't want to stop it. But which way is it going to go? Who's in charge of that? Can we have a more open conversation where we say, look, we'd like it to go in this direction. Hey, and you know what? It's actually being trained on our data. So maybe we should have a say or at least an ask with regard to how Microsoft and Google head. And, if those two companies end up with mega monopolies over the large learning models, for example, perhaps they should pay higher tax in a graduated way, as Kim Klossings of UCLA Law School has proposed, because that would give them and their shoulders an incentive to consider seriously whether they'd be better off breaking themselves up, having more competition in that space, and allowing more diversity of business models and more diversity of thought. So that's what we're putting forward today. That's my opening statement, and I'm very happy to hear and learn from Rob's rebuttal.
Great. Rob, what say you?
Well, thank you, Carol, for moderating this. And Simon, it's a pleasure to be with you again, because I do want to tout our respective horns, because as we noted earlier before that we started, there really was almost no one caring or thinking about how do we spread the fruits and the benefits of the tech economy beyond places where you are, MIT and Boston or Silicon Valley. And now we are doing that. Congress has played that important role. So let me make a couple of sort of overarching points. Number one, I agree with Simon that income inequality has gone up, although I don't. The evidence is very clear that the bottom has grown. And I'll talk about it. Bottom wages have grown. They just haven't grown quite as much as the very top. But technology is by far not the cause of this. There are other explanations for this, particularly the rise of the winner-take-all economy. When we wrote our book, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business, there was a study from the mid-2000s that found that the top 15 hedge fund managers made more in 1 year than all the corporate 500 CEOs. And they make a lot of money. So that's not caused by technology. That's caused by power and other social factors. So let me start by saying, one of Simon's core points in this book is that we choose technology. I don't agree at all. I think there's a very strong case for technology determinism. Henry Ford did not choose these technologies just because he chose them, because he had no choice. He had to adopt mass production. Now he was the inventor of a lot of that, to be sure. He had to adopt electricity. But once he did that, those became spread all over the world. It was interesting that Stalin, of all people, so you'd think, well, Stalin, my God, that guy must be a technology choice person. He wants to choose technology that's going to help the communist cause. He actually had engineers camped out in Detroit for over 10 years in the 1930s to copy exactly what Ford was doing. So there was no choice there. Mass production in the industries where it made sense, everybody did it. Same thing today with e-commerce. There's no choice. Industries or retail sectors where e-commerce makes sense, everybody's going to do it. Now, Simon, you say you're in favor of automation. I don't think you really are. You're in favor of a particular kind of use of technology. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. You also talk about the fact that we should be somewhat skeptical of a particular kind of automation that replaces workers. So this is what would be called, let's just say, replacing technology versus augmenting technology. And you and Duran have very much focused on augmented technology that augments worker skills, not replaces worker task. I don't think there's any evidence for that. Right now, we have among the lowest level of unemployment in almost forever. We've had strong job creation, more than any other major country, particularly Europe. Jobs come from the supply of workers. They always have. As women entered the labor force in significant ways in the 80s, we created more demand and more jobs. And the job issue is not a supply issue. It's a demand. It's not a demand issue. It's a supply issue. As workers move into the labor force, jobs get created. You also mentioned, and I think to me, this is a kind of core disagreement that you and I have on the book and on the theory. You talk about certain jobs that have declined in certain regions that have automated. First of all, I'm very skeptical of that's Asagamblu's research. I'm quite skeptical of that, but leaving that aside, and certainly certain jobs are lost in certain industries. We did a study that looked at BLS occupational data going back to 1870, and there were massive job losses on the farms because we replaced, manual farm laborers with tractors and things like that. Do we really want a system where instead of replacing those workers with tractors, we would give them more worker-friendly size and they could cut the wheat a little bit more easily? No, of course not. You also mentioned that high school incomes of people with less than a high school degree or even a high school degree have fallen or not grown. What you have to, I think, understand there is you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing a very different group of people. And in particular, what that group now are many of them are low skill, poorly educated immigrants who, are not going to have high wage growth because they have a fourth grade education. When you compare sort of the same cohorts over time, what you find is significant growth in wages across the board. So the Atlanta Fed has a Federal Reserve Bank has a very nice website called the Wage Growth Tracker. And they found that the lower half of the wage distribution from 2000 to 2022, the lower half saw gains of nominal wages of 3.8% a year. The top half saw wage gains of 3.5% a year. That does not support the notion that there's power imbalances, that the capitalists are squeezing the lower end of the proletariat. What's interesting also is that median wage growth grew just a little bit, teeny bit, but 1% faster for non-whites than whites. So this would be blacks, Asians, Hispanics. So again, the evidence just doesn't support the notion. Another big problem with a lot of the research that you cite, and not just you, many people cite this, is that there's two main problems with this narrative that wage growth hasn't been solid. One is a focus on average hourly earnings rather than total compensation. So the St. Louis Fed says, quote, economists have long noted that focusing on average hourly earnings rather than total compensation yields an inaccurate picture of labor compensation due to the omission of employer-provided benefits. Now, the fact that healthcare costs have grown so much, and those are real benefits, and employers are paying that in a lot of cases, again, skews the picture. If you include that, you see a much better picture. The second component on the whole wage growth, and the reason I say that is that at the core of the argument, I believe, of your book, and many people now, is this narrative that says, look, we've had high productivity growth. We don't see it in wage growth. ITIF has written extensively on that. There's a lot of problems with that narrative. One is that we've overstated productivity growth for a lot of different reasons, particularly the inclusion of all of the growth in computer power, or Moore's law. That overstated productivity growth 25% in the 2000s. So you have this line of productivity going up and wages not. Well, number one, productivity didn't go up as much. Number two, that line is wage growth, not total compensation. And number three, and most importantly, it really depends upon the deflator that economists use. So if you look at what the CBO has used, and I won't get into the details whether you use the CPI or the other major deflator, the CBO finds that the real median income growth from 79 to 2014 was 51%. Even Atkinson says, who I think you might cite, and I apologize if I got that wrong, their original study found that median income went down -8%. And that's the study everybody cites today. Well, Piketty and Says found that median growth went down 8%. Obviously, all the growth went to the top. Well, Piketty and Says revised their study because they realized they had made a serious error or multiple errors. And in 2017, Piketty and Says and Zuckman came out with a study, new revised study, and it showed that median growth at that same period grew 33%. Let me just finish up by talking, I think, about this problematic term of so-so automation. And you mentioned in grocery stores. I love self-checkout. And you say, well, the other workers don't get more productive. They don't. That has nothing to do with stacking shelves or working in the back to make sure the inputs come in. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter to productivity. What we're talking about is the entire productivity of the grocery store system. And that goes up when we have self-checkout because they don't need to hire as many workers to do self-checkout. And therefore, there's the same amount of output with fewer labor hours. So I would argue that the last thing we should do is tilt away from automation that replaces workers and machine intelligence that replaces workers. The last thing I want to do is I don't want to put it under worker control. I actually think we should have stronger unions in this country, but not unions that fight automation, unions that support higher wages and benefits and more worker voice. Totally support that. What I don't support is unions or workers who act in a selfish way to limit the kinds of automation and productivity growth our society so desperately needs. If you look at the longshoremen, for example, you look at some of the most modern ports in the world, they're not in the US anymore. These ports that are completely automated, they're using AI, they're using all these other technologies. We can't do that because the longshoremen resist automation. Well, who does that help? Well, it helps the current longshore workers, but it hurts 160 million households in the US who consume goods because now those goods are more expensive. And you talk, Simon, about the writers' strike. I don't know how much writers make. Maybe they deserve more money, but that's up to the negotiation. But the last thing in the world I want to do is have writers being doing make work for writers when ChatGPT might be able to do a better job or replace some of them. If we can replace some of the writers in movies and TV, that means that movie and TV prices go down and quantity goes up. The last point I'll make is a lot of this narrative is this sort of capitalist versus proletariat narrative. Well, if the workers at the firm, the capitalists gain. In reality, as we've shown using BEA data, profits as a percentage of GDP in the last 7 years, not by the way, not counting the COVID period, but 2014 to 2019, they were actually lower than they were in the 1960s. So there's no evidence that somehow the capitalists are getting rich on automation. If they were, you would see a significant increase in profits. I think if there's a problem in the economy, it's because of, frankly, really rich people. Not corporate profits. It's really, really rich people who just make a boatload of money. And I would support taxing capital gains. I would support taxing income at normal at regular dividends at normal income. I'd support higher tax on income for higher earners. But I don't want to mess around with the sort of core part of the economy that's based on technology and automation. I think so. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, Simon, I heard a couple of things like power, not technology. Really rich people need to go. So can you give us your rebuttal fully on what Rob's
Sure. And I think I have 7 minutes. So I think Rob may be harder on rich people than I am. So that's an interesting surprise for me. Look, I think that there's a lot actually here we can agree on. And you've also given me, as usual, Rob, some really good ideas for future work and outreach that we need to do. First of all, let me say to everyone, and this is not, I'm not announcing this today. I've said this for years since we worked together on the Jumpstarting, I call it the Jumpstarting America initiative. It was also the ITIF independent initiative to double down on science spending. Rob Atkinson moved the needle. So Rob, okay, so I talk to lots of people and maybe they listen to me, but I know they listen to Rob, and he was very effective in persuading people, persuading Congress and everyone around Congress that they should spend more on science. So now that I agree that that's a dial, you could turn it up or you could turn it down. So that's like, let's spend more, let's innovate more or innovate less. But let's be clear that Rob Atkinson moved the needle. Okay, and I'm on the record. I will remain on the record for that. Well done, Rob.
Thank you,
I think. Well, thank you. Seriously. Now, there's a couple of really interesting data questions. I'll come on to those and empirical studies and so on and so forth. And I'll have a proposal of how we'll deal with that also. But I think the example of Stalin is super interesting. We do touch on this in the book. It's a long book, so maybe we should have given Stalin more pages. But what's interesting there is exactly as Rob said, Stalin, I mean, the whole the communist regime after the late 1920s into the 1930s, so Stalin's imprints all over this, absolutely did look really carefully at US factories and also American agriculture. And the whole idea of the tractor stations that they built was not just drawn from how they interpret what happened in the Midwest, for example, but they actually bought the tractors, initial tractors from the US. And one reason they were really very awful to peasants in Ukraine and other places was to squeeze them of grain that they could sell in the world market so they could buy American tractors. But what they did with that technology was so different from what we did in the United States. So in the United States, I think we can agree that farmers, including that part of the country, have been a mainstay of democracy. And there was a lot of argument about excessive corporate power at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 1900s, in which the farmers, in various ways, led, what were then called populist movements, very broad-based democratic movements, trying to break up railroad monopolies, for example. So, in our context, the mechanization of agriculture, which did come with a creation of a lot of new jobs in cities. So people left the land, were displaced by McCormick reapers, moved to Chicago, and made more McCormick reapers, right? That is the US dynamic. That was not what happened in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, this mechanization and the tractors and the harvesters were used to oppress the peasants further, to impose collective agriculture, which was actually pretty much a disaster for a long time in terms of productivity, because it was so destructive of people, basically. So different ways to use technology. I think Stalin for us is a perfect example. Stalin was taking it off the shelf. I absolutely agree with that. Stalin was copying the technology, but how you use technology and how you deploy it socially, that's a choice. And that was a choice that the Soviet Union has some really powerful warning examples from. Now, in terms of the data and the evidence, we're absolutely getting to the core questions here. So one is, well, actually, I'll take them in the order Rob put forward, which is how much should we blame if there has been some widening in income differentials, which I think actually we agree there has been some widening. How much is it winner take all, globalization, technology? It's a very good empirical question. You can get published in top journals writing about this. And my co-author Doron Esimoglu and Pascal Restrepo published recently on this in Econometrica, which is one of the top and toughest empirical journals to get into. So their estimates, which are grounded in microdata and very careful analysis, say that, yes, other factors absolutely play a role, but between 60 and 70% of what has happened in terms of the wider income differential comes from technology and comes from automation specifically. Now, there may be other studies. You can, by all means, tackle that data. Hopefully, there'll be an enormous amount of debate, but that's where the profession stands. And I would also point out that a chunk of what's attributed to globalization, which is a very important phenomenon, was, of course, made possible by new technologies in communication and improvement of transportation. So there's a technology assist on the globalization piece of the widening income dispersion. I agree that winner take all is absolutely an element of our economy, and I stand with Rob on his remarks he made about that. On the other issue of data, on actually what happened to wages and what didn't happen to wages, so we have an extensive bibliography with many sources documented. We work very closely with, Doron is a labor economist. We work very closely with David Autor at MIT. The three of us run a center for the study of the future of work. And I absolutely invite anyone on this call or watching the recording to read the book, look at our footnotes, send us what they think we've missed or corrections, other studies. I think we've had some internal debate about this, but Rob has absolutely now just convinced me that we need to put some very simple, our understanding of the statistics, the rival statistics, his version of statistics, other people's version of statistics, feel free to nominate. We'll put them all on our website. You can put them on your website. And I think showing people, unpacking the data as you were doing there, Rob, is extremely useful. That's what everyone should be doing. That's what ChatGPT doesn't do, by the way. It doesn't show its sources. So Rob's got a big advantage there. And I think that's something that we will be taking forward and showing. Our interpretation of the data is a little bit different from Rob's. I mean, Rob made some very good points in there, and some really good points about studies being revised and so on. Absolutely, we talk about all that in the book, and that's why we have so many footnotes in the book, about 100 pages of bibliographic essay, which is all the documentation and the discussion of methodologies and sources and so on. I would also say that just on the broad question of have people at the bottom lost out. So this is a statistical answer, which I think the answer is they have not done so well. Rob and I may be arguing around the margins there, but there's also this phenomenon of deaths of despair, the work of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, which has really been highly influential. Deaton, of course, is a Nobel Prize winner, one of the most careful methodologists in microeconomics and macroeconomics of this or any generation. And I think what we've seen there is, while there hasn't been a big increase in unemployment, we agree on that, there has been a change in the job prospects of men of a certain age, let's call it middle age, very widely defined, living in some parts of the country. And in fact, that was the motivation. I mean, Rob can speak for himself, but that was a big part of the motivation John Gruber and I had for Jumpstarting America, which was exactly as Rob said, spread the benefits of the technology economy to these places that were disadvantaged. Previously, before Rob, Mark, John, and I got going on this, people said, well, don't do place-based policies, have everybody move. I think the four of us were arguing, actually, that's not enough. You need to bring those jobs and the opportunities to where people are. And I'm convinced that we're going to have amazing positive effects on people's lives because the federal government is doing as Ron Atkinson and we recommend it. So I'm just feeling very comfortable about everything we've said in that space. I think it's entirely consistent. Now, as for us not wanting automation or wanting to, stop automation in grocery stores and so on, I don't think we can stop that. And I think this is, we're actually in favor of more productivity growth, and we want there to be mechanisms, including, as Rob said, stronger trade unions that would help those higher productivity gains spread throughout the economy. But the problem is, if all you're doing is reducing the headcount in the grocery store sector, then you're getting more output, fewer workers. That's an increase in average productivity. What really drives wages is marginal worker productivity, which means I'm thinking about hiring an extra person, bring them onto my team to do whatever it is. How much was that person going to contribute to my sales, to my bottom line, to what I think our prospects are going to be? That's why you get a high wage or, frankly, a low wage. And that's the problem, is we're not generating enough of those high productivity, new tasks, new jobs being done by people. So I think this is additional. I think we can have it all, Rob, actually. And I want it all, just like I wanted it all on the science spending. I think we continue down the road of the automation, the machine intelligence, because, that's a juggernaut that, Doron and I are not going to stop. But let's add on to that. And the discussion we're having with people in the tech sector, I mean, creative people, software people in the tech sector is I think, very positive, which is they're not opposed to adding machine usefulness to the agenda, or even pushing it hard, or even thinking about what could be a funding agenda that would support that. We've got to do more work on data, more work on understanding what exactly would make a difference. I completely agree there. But I think people are really open to the idea that there are sort of two legs you can pursue at the same time, and one of them is currently much stronger than the other. So that's what we're arguing for, and that's what we're seeking to bring more attention to. And I do think that the writer's strike is illustrative of the question. We empower and to use the new technology, whether we'll get just giving more power to the studios to do that. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Simon. And your rebuttal, Rob.
Yeah, well, thank you, Simon. Again, there's a lot we agree on, and I think there are things that we don't agree on. And let me go right to the heart of the matter. You mentioned that what really drives wages is marginal worker productivity. I don't really believe that's true. What drives wages really are labor markets. So if that were the case, I visited. I suppose you're not supposed to say this anymore because tobacco is not good. But I'm fascinated with factories. I love factory tours, and when you drive through Richmond, you can actually take a tour of the Philip Morris factory. It's just a really cool tour. And at least you used to be able to. And when you do that, what you see is like a big giant train coming in where it flips the entire train car upside down, dumps the tobacco, and it's all automated. The value added per worker in a cigarette factory is enormous. It's enormous. The value added in a per worker in a textile factory is much smaller. Their wages do not reflect value added. The reason their wages don't reflect value added is that they would be paying those tobacco workers a couple $100,000 a year. Everybody would go there, would bid down the wages, and nobody would go in the textiles, would bid up the wages. So I don't want to say that there's no relationship, but that's not really the basis of wages. Secondly, you mentioned that with the grocery stores. Well, why that is important for workers? It's not important for the workers who still stay at the grocery store where there's more automation. I mean, I recently shopped at the Amazon up here in Friendship Heights, and the Amazon Foods Fresh or whatever it is, and it's fantastic. You just stick your stuff in the cart. You don't even you don't even have to bother with self-checkout. I love that. Why is that good for workers? Because if the main way worker wages, or in this case, real inflation adjusted incomes have gone up over the last 100 years, is the fact that products and services have gotten cheaper. We used to spend 35% on food. Now we spend 7%. So my wage might have not gone up, but it went a lot farther because I can take what I'm making and I don't have to pay as much. So for example, if we can get AI models to really automate consumer law, think about that. Writing a will, rental contract and all that. I mean, we're getting there. We would reduce the cost of legal services for millions and millions of people, many of them low and middle income workers, and they'd be better off, even though lawyer wages might not change at all. One of you raised a couple other good points, men versus women, and one of the statistics that people often use is they look at male wages and there's been a problem. Well, look, the reality is that female wages have grown 70%, male wages have grown a lot less. Now, that wasn't because we're overpaying women, it was because we were underpaying women. So they rightly picked up more of the growth. But you can't just say, well, men didn't do well. The reality is we have to look at the entire labor market, and women caught up. You can argue whether they fully caught up or not. That's not my point. But you can't just say, well, men. I agree the Deaths of Despair, Angus Deacon's work and others is important, but I don't see that as a technology issue. In some way it is, because manufacturing has gotten more productive and those were tended to be good jobs for less educated people. But at the end of the day, I hate to say it, I will take that trade-off. I think we have to have automation. What we fail to do completely, first of all, we run this massive trade deficit, $1 trillion a year, and when we have a very weak manufacturing policy. Carol used to run the MEP program. Other countries invest 5, 10, 20 times more in their SME manufacturing support system than we do. So we could create a lot more manufacturing jobs, and we should. And a couple of things. When Duran says 60% of the income inequality comes from tech, when you look at there's a very good study that the Economic Policy Institute did, and nobody can accuse EPI of being on the side of the employer. They're sort of liberal left-wing economics group with a lot of AFL-CIO backing, and they do quite good research. They said inequality did not increase as a result of middle wage job being eliminated by productivity growth. Almost all of the increase in inequality was within occupations, not between occupations. with some individuals making winner-take-all incomes at the expense of other workers. So, for example, if you look at the growth of income inequality among college-educated workers, it's growing dramatically. The fact that somebody, some hedge fund guy or gal has a master's degree and is making $1 billion a year, that has nothing to do with income or technology. And they say basically that income inequality was not caused by robots, it was caused by a small share of the 1.1%ers. So my solution is we should get robots to put hedge fund managers out of work. This would help with all of that. Two other things, and just, you know, I've struck at the end of the book, we both agree on the higher minimum wage. I think it's frankly atrocious that we have not raised the minimum wage. I don't understand, by the way, why Democrats didn't do this. They had control of all the branches, why they couldn't raise the minimum wage. It doesn't have to be 15, although it probably should be, but it should be raised and indexed to inflation. And then the last point I'll just make is, I mean, you talk about, you know, Google and some of these big companies. You know, I recently read there was a study by AI Now, which is a kind of anti-corporate, anti-tech group, and they have a big thing. AI is not possible without big tech. I was like, you realize you're making my point for me, right? Which is AI is not possible without big tech. And you know, these companies, if you look at the top 5 American technology companies, they spend more on, first of all, they're in the top 10 in the world of all R&D spenders, all the companies in the world. And secondly, they spend more on R&D than the entire UK economy spends on R&D. So I'm glad they're putting all this. I mean, we complain all the time about corporate short-termism and companies squeezing R&D. There was a recent study by the Business Roundtable that 80% of CFOs would cut R&D this quarter to meet their earnings targets. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, they don't do that. They're putting money in for the long haul. And I think we need a lot more companies who are willing to do that, because that's where growth and progress comes from. So thank you. Over to you, Carol.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I came up with in listening to you all, but also in just perusing the new book from Daron and Simon. But first, I wanted to ask if either of you saw a huge opinion piece that was in this Sunday's Washington Post from Yan Wu and Sarah Jo Khanna. It had a whole thing on how AI is going to come after your job. And it lists many different jobs, and most jobs will be affected, but not at the same rate. And so in your first chapter of the book, Power and Progress, it says that nothing automatic about new technologies is going to bring widespread prosperity. Whether they do or not is an economic, social, and political choice. And my question to both of you is, okay, economic, I think you all have talked a little bit about that, but you may want to talk a little bit more. Social and political, where does that come in to help and to make sure that prosperity is spread through technology? I don't know which one of you would like to start first. Simon, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for the question, and thanks for those points, Rob, which I hope I have a chance to get to in the back and forth. So I think, Carol, let's imagine a scenario which Rob was pointing to, which is more grocery stores and more stores become automated, right? And let's say that happens really fast, because we can see the potential of the ChatGPT. It vastly exceeded what people were expecting. That's a somewhat old technology, actually. So the latest GPT version is supposed to be much better, not yet been fully released. But let's imagine that, you know, within 6 to 9 months, we lose a lot more jobs in that sector. Now, Rob's right that this would raise average productivity. It might lower the price of goods coming out of that sector. I think the evidence of that is a bit more mixed. But where are those other people going to get jobs, Carol? So that's the key issue. So automation, yes, coming. Does it have an effect on productivity? Yes, on average productivity, marginal worker productivity, we can argue about. Does that convert into higher wages? for anyone, including the people in those more productive places. The example of the tobacco factory is a good one, where it's a high productivity place. You're not going to get much higher wage because of labor market. I absolutely agree with that. So what are the new tasks? What's been created? And in those, in a lot of the previous episodes, big technological changes like Henry Ford and the assembly line and electricity, that took a long time, Carol. So the people who studied the deployment of electricity across factories, which had a huge effect on productivity, and there was a lot of automation came with that, but that took about 30 years. Some people say longer than 30 years. So there was plenty of time for new tasks to be created and for us to build the vertical around autos, for example. This field, the concern is that the generative AI is coming at us very fast. It will displace a lot of jobs, and I don't think you can stop that. Where are we in terms of creating new not make work, not about make work, but new productive tasks that either use the technology or they do something that isn't so vulnerable to the technology? Where are we on that? I think that leg of our economic development is underdeveloped, a little bit weak and a little bit neglected compared to the machine intelligence, automation, mass replacement of workers, which is the dominant paradigm.
Okay, and Rob?
Well, I think, one of the, Simon, I'm not going to compare you to Karl Marx, but
well, people still read his books after a couple hundred years, so that's
absolutely something. Karl Marx's major, sole principal error was a simple one, which he didn't believe that competition would lead to downward pressure on profits. In other words, his whole thing was there's going to be automation and it would all go to the capital. Why didn't we see that? Why are profits the same as they were 100 years ago, 200 years, 150? And the reason is simply competition. Any company that gains a short-term advantage because of automation, they're forced by the market. They don't have enough market power to jack it. Like say Ford Motor Company reduces their worker input to cars. Pretty soon Subaru is going to do that and Toyota is going to do that. And they don't have enough market power to raise prices. They do in the short run. They can in the short run, absolutely. But eventually competition spreads that out. So that's why I think we don't have to worry. We need to have a reasonable antitrust regime, which I would argue we don't have today because the neo-Brandisians are anti-corporate. But of course, we need to have the right kind of antitrust that we've had for a while. Secondly, on jobs and AI, we did a little, just for fun, analysis of the Carl Frey and Osborne study out of Oxford that said that 40% of jobs would be lost in 10 years or 20 years, whatever it was. So we looked at all their jobs and we looked at the one they predicted would have the most job loss, the occupation, and the one with the least job loss. The occupation that they predicted would have the most job loss, turns out last year it actually was a big job gainer. It gained like 18%. And the occupation that they had on the bottom as the least job loss actually lost jobs. So it's completely the opposite of what they predicted. And the reason is there are just so many different factors that go into that. We did a study a few years ago, which we should update, looking at the BLS, basically this BLS study that looks at job loss from plant closures or company closures and downsizing. So not people quitting their job. And what we found is that the rate of job loss from closures and downsizing, but in like 2018, when we looked at it last, was the lowest it's been since BLS started the data in 1995. So now the argument is, well, this is different. This time it's different. I have a couple of bets on the Long Now Foundation. Simon, happy to do one with you. We can figure out a good metric. I just don't buy it. We had the BLS productivity growth rates now are like 1%. They're pitiful. It's really, really hard to automate work, just incredibly hard because work is so complicated and multifaceted. The other part that Simon mentioned is, where are we in creating new jobs? Again, I'll go back to the study we did where we looked at BLS data from every 10 years from 1870 to the future with all the occupations. And we did an analysis of job change in each occupation, so absolute value gains and losses. What we found was that in no decade did the creation of new occupations and jobs in those outweigh the jobs that were lost from automation. In no decade. So why do we not lose jobs? Because people spent money at furniture stores, at restaurants, at getting better insurance policies. That's where jobs come from. And then a last point I'll make, which is a little, that's by the way, we need a good Federal Reserve policy, which you can argue that we have it or we don't. But if we have a high level of job loss because of automation, we need to do that. And so, Simon, I think you and I agree there, because the evidence shows quite clearly that in the short and medium term, labor market shocks are real. They can affect unemployment. I don't deny that. Absolutely, that's true. That's not true in the longer term, like after 5 years, but that doesn't do anything for the workers who lose their jobs after in the short run. So I'm very sensitive to that. We issued a report laying out a whole agenda. Again, compared to other countries, we're terrible at that. Last point I'll make is a maybe controversial one, is we hear all this narrative, particularly in the Biden administration. We have a good jobs agenda. We're going to create good jobs. Look, at the end of the day, that really does very little, because we have all these bad jobs. And by bad jobs, I don't mean there's anything inherently wrong. I admire the people who work at these jobs, but let me be clear, they're low wage jobs without requiring a lot of skill. Doesn't matter how many good jobs you create if you haven't done anything with those jobs. And to me, the answer is automation. We should automate a lot of really low wage jobs, then provide really good training and workforce adjustments so that those workers can move into better jobs. Working at a cashier in a grocery store, it's a tough job. I mean, you have to stand all day, and really hard to stand all day. I mean, I sound like a lazy office worker, but it's a hard job. And why do we need that job? A toll taker on an expressway, what an awful job, breathing in the fumes. And there's lots of jobs that are bad, or low wage, I should say, that I think we should automate, and people would be better off. Thank you.
Well, and thanks, Rob. I want to remind folks that if you have questions, to put them in the Slido. You can find the link right on the where the program is on the ITIF.org site. You can also go to Sligo and then put hashtag tech versus prosperity. One thing I do want to ask before I get to some of the questions is, I looked up past debates from ITIF, and almost 10 years ago, in September 2013, there was a debate on, is technology responsible for America's job loss? And looking at some of the things that you said at that debate fall right in line with what you're talking about in terms of job loss. The part, though, that actually made its 10-year leap to this discussion now was you ended up by saying, well, the question shouldn't be about, is what's it doing to right the labor market distribution, but, how are we looking at it? What is the, what are we doing around these different technologies to help to support prosperity coming on? So it's quite interesting that you'd come back to this, but then again, Simon says this is a 1,000-year discussion that's going on. Okay, so let's go to some of the questions in here. One of them is, what are the impacts on competition/consumers from the ongoing privatization of the internet and continued vertical integration by the biggest platforms? And Rob, I don't know if you'd like to take that one, start with that one.
Well, a couple of things. One, we seem to be living in a world where competition is an end and not a means. Competition is a means. You want more of it sometimes and less of it other times. For example, I just read there was a good article in the Wall Street Journal about Rolls-Royce competing with GE, and there you have a duopoly, and yet Rolls-Royce is losing money. How can that be? So industries, you can't look at industries just basically on what's called the HHI or the C4 ratio. You have to look at them in terms of what the actual competitive dynamics in an industry are. And when I look at the at platforms, there's an enormous amount of competition in two ways. One, first of all, the impact on consumers is the price of my Google search has been going up a lot from 0 to 0. I don't pay for it. I don't pay for it. I don't pay for TikTok. I don't pay for Facebook. I don't pay for Twitter. Well, I might start paying for Twitter. I guess you never know. But I don't right now. And secondly, there's a lot of competition, and it's not like there's competition like, well, maybe TikTok has a lot of the market in these short videos, although YouTube does that too, and others.
And Instagram.
Instagram. But what they're competing on is eyeballs. So every minute I'm on Facebook or Instagram or whatever is a minute I'm not on the others. So they have intense competition to keep you focused on their platform. So it's not like other monopoly where they could be lazy monopolist and not innovative. They know that if they don't, I mean, look at Facebook, look at TikTok that came out from nowhere and now is, taking a lot of the ad revenue from some of the other players. So I'm not really all that worried about that space. I think that's not to say that antitrust shouldn't look at anti-competitive conduct if it were to occur, but I don't really worry about the structure too much.
Okay.
So I would say that I agree completely that competition is super important and also allowing new entry. And I agree with Rob that how you define the market and what you're competing over is very important. So you do need to be flexible and somewhat modern about that. Of course, there may be problems. You may have plenty of competition, but problems with the behavior of corporate actors. And I think some of the ways that Facebook has acted, for example, around ethnic tension and extreme social polarization in other societies has become very problematic, and they've come in for a lot of criticism on those grounds. I think that's an anti-competition argument, but that is a business model concern that people have. I think the concern, though, Carol, on generative AI is if it is the case that Google and Microsoft, for example, have or establish or now build dominant positions that are far stronger than anyone else's, that's a possibility. It's not what everyone thinks is happening, but it is a possibility. Then I think there would be a case for looking at this through the same lens that the country looked at Standard Oil before World War I. Now, remember when Standard Oil was broken up into 25 or 26 pieces, the value of that block of shares, so the wealth of the shareholders went up. John D. Rockefeller became richer. There was more competition in and around the oil market, and I don't think people look back on that with regret. Now, the graduated corporate tax idea that Kim Clausen has proposed is very nice, because it says if you get a monopoly and mega profits, then you would pay a high tax rate. But if you don't, if you're more, I think where Rob thinks you might go, where the economist thinks what the economists think is going to happen in the magazine, which is just going to have lots of competition, lots of different models, then you're not going to have mega profits. You're not going to pay the higher tax rate. So I think that's sort of calibrated to market outcomes. And I do think it would be very hard for the antitrust authorities anytime soon to break up Microsoft or Google. It's just the technology is moving too fast. How you define the market is tricky, and it's also going to be the case that those companies would resist, as they have every right to resist. And this is a rules-based society, so we do like to take our time, and we do like to have proper legal procedures and so on. So I think giving shareholders an incentive to break up a mega monopoly with mega profits, that's a very appealing idea. The shareholders can work it out with management.
I would just add, by the way, I think one of the things I worry about with a lot of this conversation we're having, not Simon's point, which I mostly agree with, is this is such a new technology. It would be like, let's imagine regulating automobiles in 1909. How would we do that? What I worry about, what I think is even perhaps a very likely scenario, but who knows? If I knew, I wouldn't be running a think tank. I'd be investing and retired on all the money I would earn. But I think a very likely scenario is that you're going to see narrow verticals. You might have a couple of AI companies and large language models that really go into law or legal services. My son used to work for a Silicon Valley company until recently, when he left to go pursue his advanced degree, is a company called Farmers Business Network, which is trying to use AI and other kinds of big data analytics for farmers. So I think that may be a certain thing we see, where we see a lot of verticals. So we'll see them in education. You see a bunch of companies trying to. So it may not be that the big generic LLMs from Google and Microsoft and others become dominant. We just don't know how the technology and the business models are going to play out.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Another question is, said Professor Johnson's critique implies that he is unfamiliar with Romer's exogenous growth theory. And I see you can see this question, Simon. What say you?
Yeah, what's the famous line here? I know Paul Romer. Paul Romer is a friend of mine, and so on and so
yes.
forth. Yeah, look, Paul Romer's growth theory, which is tremendously influential from the late 1980s, and also work on this in the early 1990s. I think that's absolutely central to what we argued in Jumpstarting America, and also what Rob and Mark Murrow are arguing, which is you need to create ideas, and when you create ideas, you can get some increasing returns, and you can actually break free of some of what was previously considered to be the constraints on growth. And that's exactly why we argued for breakthrough science in Jumpstarting America. And that's why we're taking all of the generative AI and all this AI moment very seriously right now. I think Romer is present throughout this conversation. He's certainly very, very prominent in our book, which I hope the questioner will buy and read for themselves. Right. I think that on that very good point about the auto industry, I think it is true in some jurisdictions, certainly in the UK, Rob, that people didn't have driver's licenses until the 1930s, right? So there were decades of development of the auto industry. If you could survive driving the car and you didn't bump into things, you could drive a car. And then regulation came along and says, okay, we need some minimum level of driver education. But that took decades. I think the concern with AI is that it's coming at us very fast. I mean, ChatGPT, as far as I can see, was the fastest establishment of a global brand name ever. And it wasn't just a brand name. People have actually used it and are working with it and are training it around the world. I mean, there was 100 million was the number after, I think, 2 to 3 months. It's presumably more than that. So that's a speed of change that is remarkable, maybe unprecedented, certainly right up there. And I think that, I mean, again, we're not trying to stop it. We're not trying to say you need a driver's license to use ChatGPT. What we're saying is there's a focus on replacing people that is not the only focus to have, and it can be complemented, supplemented, and it may be even made stronger by generating more new jobs, more new tasks for people, and putting more effort at the corporate level, the social level, the private level, and maybe the government level into those activities. Now, when we did the Jumpstarting America, when Rob and Mark were pushing, I think we had a much clearer idea of the problem to be solved and what kind of technologies would be needed. And also, I think we were both fairly technology agnostic. We said, look, do more science, there'll be spillover effects. This is true across a lot of different scientific fields. I will totally agree. And one reason we wrote the book was to try and really get people to focus on it. What are we missing exactly in technology development? What are those? If we're going to build, for example, a big expansion of our electricity grid and electrical capabilities for clean energy, and have a lot of people doing that, what are the technologies that will make those workers more productive? Higher marginal worker productivity, and then what's the labor market context? Rob flagged that for us very importantly. I mean, I might become super productive, but if there's a lot of unemployment around me, or if there's the alternative is they hire somebody out of the textile worker to replace me at a lower wage, I'm not going to get the benefits of that marginal productivity gain, am I? So thinking about the power of the structural labor markets, but key that we want more technology that will help workers become more productive. And yes, then in that world, if that leg is going fast, then I think the grocery store model that Rob likes, where you don't need anywhere near as many workers, maybe you need no workers, that would not be a concern. But where are the new jobs? Why aren't we getting more of these new jobs at high wages and using skill, needing skill? I think Rob and I also agree on the importance of training and an education system that keeps pace with that and supports it. Thank you.
Well, what you all don't agree on is that you said, Simon, that technology. People choose technology, and Rob says people, they don't choose it. It comes. They have to have it. So that's where I think the careful consideration going forward is not going to be as easy. Another question is,
Carol, can I just quickly respond to Simon?
Yes,
so Simon,
absolutely.
Thank you. I think this is a little bit like, the Miller beer commercial, tastes great, less filling. You think it's less filling. I think it tastes great. And I think in reality, we both think it's less filling and tastes great. You might put a little more emphasis. So to be clear, I think that there are going to be lots and lots of applications where, whether it's robotics or AI, where they're going to complement and improve a worker's capability. It's going to be like a surgeon having a better tool. And I don't think that's bad. I think it's great. What I just worry about is tilting the playing field. The other thing I think is important, my co-author and friend Mike Lynn just came out with a new book called Hell to Pay. It's a very interesting book, and it talks about the political consequences of low wages. And I think we have to take that quite seriously, because that's a very destructive part. So that's why I support a much higher minimum wage. That's why I would support this is very controversial, but I do think there's a lot of evidence that excessive levels of low skill immigration, particularly illegal, does suppress wages at the bottom end. There are other things we could do. If you look at how much money companies spend on worker training as a share of GDP, it's fallen by half. So they're clear. And then the last part of that is, I think you Simon, you know this work quite well, but you have sort of high road strategies versus low road strategies. And the high road strategy, Carol, that's a lot of what MEP was doing. You want to compete on the basis of skills, technology, organization, all of that stuff. Or you can just compete on, let's pay the workers as little as possible, never invest in a new machine. And there's good evidence that shows you can be in equilibrium at high or low. The economists say, well, there's only one equilibrium. You can have two equilibriums. You can be in perfect equilibrium at the low road strategy. And so I think Simon and I would fully agree that we need conscious national policies to think, how do we move a lot more towards the high road? I think that includes technology use and some automation. That would be it.
Yeah, I completely. When we run this on our Twitter feed, Rob, we're just going to take that clip of you, what you just said there, and endorse that for you. Okay. I thought it was a great statement, really spot on. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, and coming from the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, the MEP program, seeing real time what happens when individual companies are assisted with automation, you don't see necessarily replacement. In fact, in as high levels as you would think, you see more of move to a different job or expand. It allows some companies to go after growth, because now they have employees that they don't need to do these things that are now automated. And I don't know how well that's being captured, but I can show you in the numbers from the MEP program that it is definitely not a one-to-one, and it's not even even a 2-to-1. It depends on where that company is in its growth cycle as to what happens to the worker once it automates or brings in technology. Okay, we have just about 10 minutes left. That I do want to get a couple of questions in, especially the last one. But this one is, it says, I'm just over halfway through Deaton and Case's Deaths of Despair. Has their work influenced either of you? Thoughts on how their work overlaps with your work? And I don't know, Simon, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think I already said, Carol, that I think it's very important and influential work. And I heard Rob say that he agreed with the very sad facts, the outcomes, and sort of the disagreement is the precise attribution of causes. How much was technology, how much was globalization, how much was other forces, and how those things combine. But I think Case and Deaton did us a really important service by flagging these issues and documenting them so carefully and laying before us particularly the geography of the problem. And that was what my previous work was about, the Job Starting America we've talked about. So taking tech jobs and high productivity jobs, exactly the kind Rob just laid out, taking them to people where they live now, as opposed to saying, hey guys, if you want a better job, just move to Silicon Valley, because that's not a solution, including in part because they don't build enough housing in Silicon Valley. So housing costs are very high. And it used to be the case, if you moved from a low productivity, low wage place like Louisiana in the 1950s, you moved to California, Bay Area, your income did go up, even if you didn't change occupation. That's not your income post housing costs, certainly. That's not the case now because housing costs are so high. So that's the motivation of do more tech, spread around, use the abilities everybody has already, and help them develop it more throughout the country. I think more good jobs is my bumper sticker, Carol, always. And I think we get. I don't like the fact that you guys are using technology versus prosperity, even in your summary thing. I don't think it's technology versus prosperity. I think it's technology for shared prosperity. And we want to talk about how do we share it, how much prosperity are we getting, how do we balance that out? But it's technology is essential for shared prosperity. That's what I would say.
Okay. Let's go to the last question. I have to say that I was concerned, and Rob knows this, that there might be some kerfuffle between the two of you all in this debate. But there seems to be a large area that you both agree on, just in nuance how to go forth with it. They ask, shared prosperity requires a political solution. In the current atmosphere, is this feasible?
Well, is anything feasible in this current environment? I do want to make a key point, though. When I hear the term shared prosperity, to me, it's, of course, we should have shared prosperity. But what I worry about, and this really, again, goes to, I think, the core, perhaps, area. I think automation, like straight up automation, replacing bowling pin setters with Brunswick pin setting machines, create shared prosperity. So, secondly, there's a notion in the shared prosperity that somehow, again, it's this worker versus capitalist. And there's data from, I think it's the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, which does these nice data charts. Median income in 1980 was $29,800. In 2022, it was $60,000. Corporate profits in 22 were a little bit higher. There went up from 8.1 to 10%. Okay, if you just eliminated all those, got the corporate profits down to 8% and took it out of income would go down by about $1,000 a year. Not very much money. So look, at the end of the day, we're not going to get prosperity through just redistribution from companies.
Right.
That's different than saying, can we get it from rich people? I don't think I don't think we're going to. I think the politics are so tough, in part because, frankly, each side is pretty extreme. The Democrats now, a lot of them have focused on an anti-growth message, an anti-corporate message, an anti-technology message, and in a lot of ways, if the Republicans hadn't embraced this, fairly deregulatory, cut taxes on the rich agenda from the 1980s, we wouldn't be in this situation in reality or in our politics today. So they went too far the other way. Clearly, we needed we shouldn't be taxing the rich at 80%, and we needed smart regulation, of course. But my argument is they went too far, and now there's a backlash, and the left and the Democrats are going too far the other way. And it's really disconcerting, because I do think among reasonable people, like Simon and I don't agree on everything, but I think we could agree on an agenda, and we could all agree on a good agenda in our politics. So I'm not hopeful. Let's put it that way.
Okay, well, I'll take the other side of that. I am hopeful, Carol, because while I agree, I think we'll be using a clip of what Rob's analysis of what happens in the 1980s. I like that quite a lot. I think that we are stuck on distribution and redistribution. And I think what we've learned from history, 1,000 years of history, I would claim, please take a look at the book and tell me if you agree. But I think what we learned there is, distribution is important, and sometimes you can change it. It's what you create, how you create it, how you, it's the production end that has this massive effect on how much productivity gain we get, how much growth we get, and whether it's shared. And this was an amazing success of the American economy. I mean, U.S. economy in 1810, 1820 was regarded as a backwater and was rather sneered at by the manufacturing countries of Europe. They showed up at the Great Exhibition of the 1850s in London, and they were given a little corner space to exhibit a few guns. And by the 1890s, the US is the powerhouse of the world, and wages are going up, and industry does well, and there's countervailing power in the form of unions, and prosperity did get shared. That was mostly about what was produced, how it was produced, and how the labor market worked, and how. And I think that capital was very pro-labor in the 1920s and 50s and 60s. I think this antagonism has been there, sure, all along, but that was not at the peak of maximum shared prosperity. I would say, though, the reason for my optimism is what happened with our previous round of the place-based policies, Jumpstart America, and the ITIF proposals there. I think that the Chips and Science Act got 64 senators in the end. Rob, is that right? Support. So that's bipartisan support. And I think the way that happened, Carol, was it was a bit of an end run around. There were certain issues people were stuck on, and we were not trying to move them where they were already stuck. We were saying, look, here's something that you can do, you can add on. It makes sense anyway. I mean, I do think what happened in COVID, what happened with China, other context changes. So events changed, but it's, even if events drive the world, you have to have the ideas and the proposals out there, and they have to get a bit of a pounding and a field testing, which is what we're doing today, for anyone to say, you know what, I think there is an idea. Let's go to ITIF and see what they've got off the shelf. Because I heard them, I heard Rob and Mark Murrow at this event at Brookings, and maybe we can go in that direction. So people have to be prepared for that, Carol. And I don't know when the opportunity will come, but those opportunities do come. And I think, and I thank Rob and ITIF and you, Carol, and everybody who works on these things for preparing us for those moments of opportunity.
Thank you, Simon. And you'll have the last word on that. Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate it. Hope everybody enjoyed our debate today. And don't forget Power and Progress. It will continue with what we've discussed today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you.